They tied her to the blood-stained stones, expecting the monster of the mountains to tear her apart. But the beast that emerged from the shadows didn't want her life. He wanted his crown. The pack thought they were sacrificing a weakling. Instead, they had delivered the rightful king, his queen. The wind howling through the jagged peaks of the Dragon-Tooth Mountains felt less like air and more like a blade scraping against Genevieve's skin. Her wrists were bound with thick, rough-hewn hemp, the fibers biting into her flesh until her hands went completely numb. She was pressed back against the ancient runic monoliths that marked the absolute boundary of the Silvermont Pack's territory. Beyond these stones lay the deadlands, a frozen, inhospitable wilderness claimed by the creature they only called the Cursed Wolf. Standing 20 paces away, wrapped in luxurious, heavy furs that his people had starved to provide, was Alpha Roland Hayes. Roland's breath plumed in the freezing air as he looked upon Genevieve with a mixture of feigned solemnity and barely concealed relief. For generations, the pack had been bound to a gruesome treaty. Every 10 years, to appease the monstrous feral beast that supposedly plagued their borders and caused their crops to wither, a sacrifice was required. It was always a woman. It was always someone the pack deemed expendable. Do not weep, Genevieve. Roland projected his voice so the shivering crowd of villagers huddled behind him could hear. His tone was laced with practiced, sickening empathy. Your sacrifice guarantees the survival of Oakhaven. Your name will be written in the ledger of martyrs. The beast shall be fed, and the moon goddess will smile upon your family. Genevieve spat on the frozen ground at his boots. Her father, Arthur Croft, had been the pack's chief archivist and historian. He had died under highly suspicious circumstances just 3 months prior, shortly after claiming he had found discrepancies in the pack's historical treaties and Roland's tax levies. Genevieve had been quietly vocal about her suspicions, demanding an investigation, and so, conveniently, when the decennial lottery for the sacrifice was drawn, it was Genevieve's name that Roland pulled from the wooden chalice. "You aren't doing this for the pack, Roland," Genevieve hissed, her voice hoarse from the cold. "You're doing this because I know my father didn't fall off the western cliffs by accident. You're feeding me to a monster to bury the truth." Roland's eyes narrowed, the facade dropping for a fraction of a second. He stepped closer, ensuring the wailing wind masked his voice from the villagers. "Truth is a luxury the dead cannot afford, Genevieve. Goodbye." He turned his back on her, raising a hand. The villagers of Oakhaven, people Genevieve had known her entire life, the baker who gave her extra bread, the seamstress she had helped during the fever outbreak, lowered their heads and followed their alpha back down the mountain path. Not a single one looked back. The silence that fell over the clearing as they departed was heavier than the snow. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long skeletal shadows through the pine trees, the temperature plummeted further. Genevieve closed her eyes, trembling violently. She prepared herself for the end. The stories of the cursed wolf were the stuff of nightmares. They said it was a creature the size of a warhorse, driven mad by dark magic, with eyes like liquid hellfire and jaws that could snap a man in half. An hour passed, then the rustling began. It wasn't the frantic sound of a wild animal, but the deliberate heavy crunch of massive paws pressing into the deep snow. The air suddenly smelled different. The crisp scent of pine was overwhelmed by the raw, crackling scent of ozone, rain, and wild musk. Genevieve opened her eyes. Stepping out from the veil of the blizzard was a wolf, but the word seemed entirely insufficient to describe the being before her. It stood nearly 6 feet tall at the shoulder. Its fur was a thick, midnight black, dusted with frost, scarred heavily along its massive shoulders and flanks. That it was the eyes that made Genevieve stop breathing. They weren't the mindless, bloodshot voids of the feral beast. They were a striking, piercing silver, and they were intelligent, incredibly, hauntingly intelligent. The beast approached her slowly, its massive head lowering to her eye level. Genevieve pressed herself flat against the freezing stone, squeezing her eyes shut, waiting for the agony of teeth tearing into her throat. Instead, she felt a huff of warm breath against her cheek. The giant wolf sniffed her neck, lingering for a moment, a low, rumbling vibration echoing in its broad chest. It was a sound of recognition, a sound of absolute fury, but not directed at her. With a sudden snap of its jaws, the wolf lunged. Genevieve screamed, but the teeth bypassed her flesh completely, clamping down on the thick ropes binding her wrists. With one violent jerk of its massive head, the hemp snapped like rotten twine. Genevieve collapsed into the snow, gasping, rubbing her raw, bleeding wrists. She looked up in pure shock. The monster wasn't looking at her as prey. It gently nudged her shoulder with its wet nose, then turned its massive head toward the treacherous path leading deeper into the Deadlands, before looking back at her. Follow. The command wasn't spoken, but the intent was as clear as crystal. With no home to return to, and an impossible creature offering her a choice, Genevieve dragged herself to her feet and followed the beast of the crags into the darkness. The trek through the blizzard felt like a fever dream. Whenever Genevieve stumbled, her legs giving out from exhaustion and the biting cold, the massive wolf would pause. It would stand beside her, acting as a windbreak, allowing the radiating, supernatural heat of its enormous body to warm her, until she could stand again. Just before dawn, the trees broke, revealing a structure that made Genevieve gasp. Thrust out of the side of the mountain were the crumbling, majestic stone towers of Caerleon, the ancient, original fortress of the Silvermont Pack, abandoned nearly 50 years ago. The wolf led her through the ruined gates and into the great hall. To her astonishment, the hall was not a frozen tomb. A massive fire roared in the central hearth. Heavy pelts covered the stone floors, and a crude but functional living space had been carved out of the ancient grandeur. It was not a beast's lair. It was a home. The wolf walked toward the fire, its breathing suddenly becoming labored. It let out a sound that was half growl, half shriek of agony. Genevieve watched in terrified awe as the beast's bones began to crack and snap. The massive form shrank, fur receding into skin, the monstrous anatomy contorting violently. Genevieve averted her eyes, feeling she was intruding on something deeply intimate and agonizing. When the horrifying sounds finally ceased, she heard the rustle of clothing. "You can look." The voice was a deep, raspy baritone, carrying the weight of unuse and profound weariness. Genevieve turned. Standing by the fire, wearing a loose linen shirt and dark trousers, was a man. He was exceptionally tall, with a physique carved by brutal survival. His jaw was covered in thick, dark stubble, and his shoulder-length black hair was wild. But it was his face that arrested her. He was strikingly handsome. There were jagged silver scars ran down the left side of his face, disappearing beneath the collar of his shirt. And his eyes, they were the exact same piercing, intelligent silver as the wolf's. "You," Genevieve stammered, her mind racing to connect the pieces. The history books her father kept, the portraits in the deepest archives, the silver eyes of the royal bloodline. "You're not just a cursed rogue." "I had been called many things, Genevieve Croft," the man said, pouring a cup of steaming liquid from a kettle over the fire and offering it to her. She took it, her fingers brushing his, a sudden, shocking jolt of electricity zipping up her arm at the contact. He felt it too, his silver eyes flashing wide for a fraction of a second before he composed himself. "You know my name?" she asked softly. "I know the names of all the people Roland Hayes tries to murder," he replied bitterly, sitting heavily in the carved wooden chair by the fire. "I am Alistair Montgomery, though 15 years ago, before I was poisoned, cursed, and thrown off the cliffs of my own territory, the people of Silvermont called me their Alpha King." Genevieve dropped the cup. It shattered on the stone floor, hot tea pooling around the pelts. "Alistair," she breathed. "But the records. Thomas Hayes, Roland's father, wrote that you died of the blood rot, that you went feral and had to be put down for the safety of the pack, that he reluctantly took the mantle of Alpha to save us." Alistair let out a humorless, dark laugh. Thomas Hayes was a coward who couldn't stand the thought of a king who intended to distribute the pack's wealth evenly. He and a council of traitorous elders hired a blood witch. They didn't kill me. Killing an Alpha King unleashes a magical shockwave that alerts the entire continent. Instead, they poisoned me with wolfsbane laced with dark magic. It forced my shift, locked me in my wolf form, and drove me mad with agony. They dumped me in the Deadlands to die of exposure. He leaned forward, the firelight casting harsh shadows over his scarred face. But they underestimated how stubborn the Montgomery bloodline is. It took me 5 years to break the witch's mental hold. Another 5 to figure out how to force my body to shift back to human form, even if the pain nearly stops my heart every time I do it. Genevieve's mind was reeling, but a horrifying question pushed its way to the front. If you are the cursed wolf, what about the sacrifices, the treaty? Sarah Jenkins, Abigail Miller, Catherine Reed. The girls offered every decade? Alistair looked at her, his expression softening into profound sorrow. There is no treaty, Genevieve. I never demanded a single life. Then what happened to them? I saved them, Alistair said simply. 10 years ago they tied Sarah to those same stones. I broke her free. She told me Thomas Hayes had discovered her listening at the door during a secret council meeting. She was a liability, so she became a sacrifice. I guided her through the mountains to the human coastal cities. She's married now, owns a bakery. Genevieve felt the air leave her lungs. The sheer magnitude of the Hayes family's deception was staggering. They weren't appeasing a monster. They had invented a boogeyman to keep the pack in perpetual fear, using the mythical beast as an executioner for anyone who posed a political threat, or anyone who asked too many questions. Just like her father, just like her. Roland knows, Genevieve whispered, rage suddenly igniting in her chest, replacing the cold. He knows you don't eat them. He just leaves us out here to freeze to death, or to be killed by actual wild robes, knowing the pack will never look for the bodies. Yes, Alistair agreed softly. He stood up, towering over her, his presence intoxicating and overwhelming. He reached out, his thumb gently wiping a tear of anger from her frozen cheek. The mate spark flared between them again, undeniable and consuming. Your father, Arthur, Alistair murmured, was sending me secret missives via Raven for the past year. He found my mother's old journals. He knew the truth about me. He was preparing to present the evidence to the regional council to have Roland stripped of his title. That is why Roland killed him, Genevieve. And that is why he tried to kill you. Genevieve looked up into the silver eyes of the rightful Alpha King. The fear that had paralyzed her on the sacrificial stones was completely gone. In its place burned a need for vengeance so intense it frightened her. Alistair, she said, her voice steady and resolute, you have survived in the shadows for 15 years. I think it's time the king returned to Oakhaven. A slow, dangerous smile spread across Alistair's scarred face. I was hoping you'd say that, little wolf. But taking down Roland requires a war, and a king cannot declare war without his queen. The ancient fortress of Carleon became their war room. Over the next 3 weeks, Genevieve did not merely survive in the icy ruins. She thrived. The fire between her and Alistair, initially sparked by the shocking revelation of their mate bond, deepened into a profound strategic partnership. He had the raw power, the royal bloodline, and the tactical mind of a military commander. She had the intimate current knowledge of Oakhaven's political landscape, the patrol routes, and the weaknesses of Roland's inner circle. More importantly, she had the ledger her father died protecting. Genevieve had hidden the leather-bound book beneath the floorboards of her cottage before the lottery. Alistair, utilizing his wolf form's immense speed and stealth under the cover of a moonless night, retrieved it. When they laid the pages out on the stone table in Carlion's great hall, the sheer scale of Roland's treason became undeniable. "He hasn't just been stealing from the pack's treasury," Genevieve said, her fingers tracing the meticulous, cramped handwriting of her late father. "Look at these shipments, grain, steel, and silver. He's been trading raw silver from our ancestral mines to the blood coven of the Crimson Peak." Alistair's jaw tightened, the silver scar on his face pulling taut. The blood coven were the very dark magic practitioners who had forged the curse that kept him trapped in his beast form for a decade. "He's paying them for protection," Alistair deduced, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "The curse they placed on me requires constant magical maintenance. It feeds on their rituals. That's why he starves the pack. The wealth goes to the witches to ensure I never reclaim my throne. And if we cut off the supply or break the witch's totem..." Genevieve looked up at him, her eyes bright with a dangerous intelligence. "My strength returns fully, and the pain of shifting disappears," Alistair finished. He reached across the table, his large, calloused hand covering hers. The electric spark of the mate bond hummed between them, warm and anchoring. "But we cannot take on Roland's guard and a coven of blood witches alone." "We aren't alone," a new voice echoed from the shadows of the arched doorway. Genevieve jumped, instinctively reaching for the hunting knife Alistair had given her, but Alistair merely stood, a respectful nod gracing his features. Stepping into the firelight was a woman in her early 30s, draped in heavy, expensive woolen cloaks that denoted high merchant status. Her eyes were sharp, a posture commanding. Genevieve recognized her instantly, though she hadn't seen her since she was a little girl. "Abigail." Genevieve breathed, stunned. Abigail Miller had been the sacrifice 20 years ago. "In the flesh," Abigail said with a grim smile, stepping fully into the room. Behind her walked 3 other women, all heavily armed. Among them was Sarah Jenkins, a sacrifice from 10 years ago. "Alistair sent word to the coastal cities," Abigail explained, moving to the table. "You see, Genevieve, when the true king saves your life, you tend to swear loyalty to him. Over the past 15 years, every woman sacrificed to the beast has been smuggled out by Alistair. We changed our names. We built businesses in the human territories. We acquired wealth, steel, and mercenaries. We have been waiting for the day our king was ready to take back his crown. We are the dead women of Silvermont, and we are ready for war." The revelation struck Genevieve with the force of a physical blow. The very women Roland had discarded to maintain his terror had become the architects of his incoming destruction. "The Winter Solstice Festival is in 3 days," Genevieve said, her mind racing as she looked at the assembled women. "Roland will host the entire pack in the town square for the Feast of the Moon. His elite guards will be focused on crowd control. It's the one night the ancestral armory is lightly guarded. Then we strike on the solstice," Alistair declared, his silver eyes flashing with a predatory light. "Abigail, your mercenaries will secure the perimeter of the village and trap Roland's loyalist guards. Sarah, you and the others will infiltrate the armory and distribute weapons to the villagers who are willing to fight." "And what of Roland?" Abigail asked. Alistair looked down at Genevieve, his expression softening only for her. "Genevieve and I will march through the front gates. We will cut the head off the snake in front of the entire pack." The night before the solstice, the tension in Carlion was palpable. Genevieve found Alistair standing on the balcony of the ruined tower, staring out over the deadlands toward the distant twinkling lights of Oakhaven. The wind whipped his dark hair around his face. She stepped out into the freezing air, wrapping her arms around him from behind, pressing her cheek against his broad, muscular back. He sighed, leaning into her touch, his hands coming up to rest over hers. "Are you afraid?" he asked softly. "Of dying?" she replied. "No. I accepted death on those stones a month ago. Every day since has been a stolen gift." She stepped around to face him, looking deep into his silver eyes. "I'm only afraid of failing my father. Of failing you." Alistair cupped her face, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. "You could never fail me, Genevieve. You were the anchor that pulled me back from the edge of madness. When the witch's poison burned my veins, it was the hope of my pack that kept me alive. But now it is you. You are my mate, my equal, my queen." He leaned down, and when his lips met hers, there was no hesitation. The kiss was desperate, consuming, and fiercely protective. It was a promise sealed in the freezing winds of the mountains, a vow that whatever happened tomorrow, they would face it as one. The winter solstice feast was the grandest lie Roland Hayes ever told. The town square of Oakhaven was draped in crimson and gold banners. Enormous bonfires roared, casting dancing shadows over the faces of the half-starved villagers who were forced to celebrate their alpha's benevolence. Roland sat upon a carved wooden throne at the head of the square, wearing a crown of woven silver branches, drinking wine, while his people shivered in threadbare coats. Beside him on the dais stood an ornate pedestal-mounted brazier burning with an unnatural green flame. Genevieve knew from her father's notes what it was, the witch fire totem. As long as it burned, the blood magic suppressing Alistair's healing factor remained active. The festivities were abruptly halted by the agonizing, echoing groan of the ancient iron gates of Oakhaven being forced open. The music stopped. The chatter died in the villagers' throats. Roland stood up, his cup of wine spilling down his heavy furs, his eyes narrowing in fury. Walking through the center of the crowd, parting the sea of terrified villagers, was Genevieve Croft. She was not the shivering, defeated girl they had left tied to the sacrificial stones. She wore dark, fitted leather armor provided by Abigail's merchants, a longsword strapped to her hip, and a cloak of deep midnight blue. She walked with the spine-chilling confidence of an executioner. "Genevieve," Roland breathed, his face draining of color. It was impossible. No one survived the Deadlands. Whispers erupted through the crowd. "Arthur's daughter. The sacrifice. She lives. Guards!" Roland roared, his shock instantly morphing into panic. "Seize her. It's a trick of the blood rot. She is infected." 10 heavily armored guards drew their weapons and rushed forward, but before they could close the distance, a deafening, unnatural roar shattered the night sky. It wasn't the howl of a wolf, it was the roar of an apex predator claiming its territory. From the shadows of the gatehouse, a massive, midnight black wolf leaped into the square. It landed with earth-shattering force, the ground cracking beneath its paws. The sheer size of the beast caused several guards to drop their swords in sheer terror. The wolf didn't attack the guards. It stood at Genevieve's side, its silver eyes locked onto Roland. Then, in front of the entire terrified pack, the beast began to shift. The villagers screamed, expecting a monster to emerge, but as the fur receded and the bones snapped into place, a towering, fiercely handsome man stood up from the snow. He wore the ancestral armor of the Montgomery line black steel, etched with silver runes. An old elder in the front row dropped to his knees, tears streaming down his weathered face. The silver eyes, King Alistair. The name rippled through the crowd like wildfire. Alistair, the Alpha King, the rightful heir. You're dead. Roland screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. My father killed you. You died of the rot. Your father was a traitor and a coward, Roland. Alistair's voice boomed, amplified by his alpha aura. The sheer weight of his command forced the loyalist guards to their knees, their wolf side submitting instinctively to the true king, and he passed his cowardice down to his son. "Kill him!" Roland shrieked, grabbing a spear from a paralyzed guard beside him. The perimeter of the square suddenly flooded with armed mercenaries. Abigail, Sarah, and the other sacrificed women stepped out of the shadows, their crossbows leveled at Roland's inner circle. "Your reign is over, Roland," Abigail called out, her voice dripping with years of suppressed vengeance. "The dead women of Silvermont have returned. Roland looked around wildly, realizing he was surrounded. In a desperate, cornered panic, he lunged not toward Alistair, but toward the brazier of green witchfire. He plunged his hand into the flames, pulling out a blackened, twisted dagger humming with toxic magic. "If I cannot rule this pack, I will slaughter it," Roland roared, throwing himself off the dais directly at Genevieve, knowing she was Alistair's weakness. Alistair moved faster than the human eye could track. He intercepted Roland midair, tackling the usurper to the frozen ground. The two men crashed through a wooden table, splintering it to pieces. Roland slashed wildly with the cursed dagger, catching Alistair across the ribs. Alistair roared in pain, a dark magic sizzling against his flesh, suppressing his rapid healing. Roland scrambled to his feet, a manic grin on his face. "The magic still holds you, Alistair." "You are weak." Genevieve didn't hesitate. While Roland was focused on Alistair, she sprinted toward the dais. She leaped onto the platform, drew her longsword, and brought the heavy steel down upon the pedestal holding the green witchfire. The stone shattered. The brazier tumbled, and the green flames spilled across the snow, immediately fizzling out into foul-smelling smoke. The connection was broken. Across the square, Alistair threw his head back and inhaled sharply. The dark veins that had plagued his body for 15 years vanished. The wound on his ribs stitched itself closed in mere seconds. The curse was broken, his full, terrifying power as the Alpha King flooded back into his blood. Roland backed away, dropping the dagger, true terror finally breaking his arrogant facade. "Wait, Alistair, please. Mercy, we are wolves. We are brothers." Alistair. Alistair stepped forward, grabbing Roland by the throat and lifting the heavy man off the ground with one hand. Roland kicked and choked, his face turning purple. The entire pack held their breath, waiting for their king to rip the traitor's head from his shoulders. But Alistair looked past Roland, meeting Genevieve's eyes. He saw the pride, the love, and the unyielding strength in his mate. A true king did not rule through terror as Roland had. A true king ruled through justice. Alistair threw Roland roughly to the ground. "Bind him," Alistair commanded the very guards who had served Roland moments ago. They rushed forward, eager to prove their renewed loyalty, slapping heavy iron chains onto the usurper. "Let him rot in the deepest cells of Carleon," Alistair announced to the silent square. "Let him live a long, cold life, knowing his name will be erased from our history, just as he tried to erase ours." The silence in the square hung heavy for a moment, before the old elder who had first recognized him stepped forward, bowing low to the ground. "Long live the Alpha King," the elder rasped. The chant was picked up by another, then another, until the entire village of Oakhaven was on their knees, their voices rising into the winter night, a chorus of salvation and loyalty. Alistair walked through the bowing crowd, ascending the dais, but he did not sit on the wooden throne. Instead, he reached out his hand to Genevieve. She took it, stepping up beside him. He pulled her close, kissing her forehead before turning to face his people. The long winter of Silvermont was finally over. The sacrifices had ended, the monsters were banished to the history books, and the true king had reclaimed his home not with a crown of woven silver, but with the brilliant, unyielding archivist who had bravely walked into the dark and led him back to the light. Thank you for exploring this incredible, real-life-inspired tale of the Silvermont archives. If you loved this deep dive into the historical betrayals, forbidden romance, and the ultimate triumph of the Alpha King and his brilliant queen, hit that like button. Share this story with your friends who love epic werewolf dramas, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more thrilling recovered myths and legends every week. Leave a comment below what would you have done in Genevieve's place.